I managed to spill hot tea on myself just now, just
Oh,
before
clever.
starting.
Clever. Clever.
All right.
Rule number three, don't have hot drinks around you.
Yeah. Hmm. I am here with Anthony Venn-Brown, the founder of Ambassadors and Bridge Builders International, author of A Life of Unlearning, and he's coming to us live from Australia, where it is morning. It is evening here, and we've got a little bit of line noise, but that's okay. We are able to talk over an incredibly long distance in real time with a live audience, and I think that's amazing. Anthony, hi.
Hi, Justin. It's great to be with you.
It's great to have you here. So, yeah, so my hand is still burning. So, okay, you have been doing this, you have been working in one way or another in in Christian ministry and dealing with with being a gay man in that space for quite some time. I just finished reading your book, A Life of Unlearning, and it's I was fascinated with how different your and my experiences have been
Oh,
in many
yes.
ways.
Oh dear. Yes, because now you know all the intimate details of my life.
So, for folks who are not familiar with your history, who haven't read your book, um, can you give us the sort of quick synopsis of like what your life up to this point has been?
Sure. I used to say I'll give you the Reader's Digest version, but I realize most young people don't know what the Reader's Digest is.
Yeah, that's a good question
Because
for our yeah, for our live viewers. Do we have folks who don't know the phrase Reader's Digest? Because I remember reading. My grandparents had Reader's Digests when I would go to their house when I was a kid. But that's the last time I think that I've seen Reader's Digest was at my
yeah.
grandparents' house.
So synopsis summary is probably a more relevant term these days. Yeah. So let me go back to probably high school when I discovered that I was same-sex attracted, and that was in the 1960s when it was still a criminal offence, and of course, people, mental health professionals were doing all sorts of things to try and cure homosexual men and women, um, and that was a horrific time to be living in. You know, I'm currently working on my next book, The Quest to Cure Queers, and in researching that, you know, I'm reminded of the terrifying time it was, knowing that possibly I could be put into a juvenile delinquent, you know, facility institution. Um, if I did go for help, you know, what the options were quite horrific. Then, of course, it was in after a suicide attempt. It was my quest to find some freedom and change was what brought me to Christianity.
Hmm.
I became born again in 1968. Sorry, 69. And then I went through all these things. You know, I thought my conversion was enough.
Mm-hmm.
Then I found out there was enough. Then I heard about the baptism of the Holy Spirit. The charismatic movement was starting here in Australia. I thought, that's the answer. So I went through all that. And then when I went to Bible college and it was still there, my principal said, well, the problem is you've got demons. So in 1971, in Auckland, I was going through weeks of exorcisms. And then when I came back to Australia, it was still there. Then I went into the world's first residential program for to cure people with their homosexuality. So this was 1972. So what I discovered in my research, Justin, is that I'm quite possibly the oldest living conversion therapy survivor in the world.
Really?
Yeah, because Exodus wasn't started until 1976.
Huh.
Love in Action started in 1974. I was doing this in 71, 72.
Wow. So
Yeah.
you were there like you've watched these groups grow and in many cases die during this time.
Yeah.
And yet I feel like I should say, like I know a lot of people who think, well, the ex-gay thing, nobody really believes that anymore, nobody really does that anymore. And yet I should mention, I have in the last few days seen multiple people on my social media feeds mention ongoing so-called ex-gay programs. A lot of them don't call themselves ex-gay anymore, but these kind of conversion therapy type programs that still exist, that people are still going to them and still being harmed by them.
Yes.
So
Yes, they're still around.
so I don't mean to cut off your story there. So you did this, early on, became a Christian, wanted to become straight, thought that this was what was supposed to happen, and that did not happen.
Yeah, and then what happened then was, I did get married to a lovely woman and had two beautiful daughters, and I became a very famous preacher here in Australia. So every weekend I was in one of the mega churches, like Hillsong, for example. I used to preach for Brian Houston when he was, starting his church. But then at the age of 40, got a big life crisis. I fell in love with a guy. And it was forced me to face the reality that up to that stage, I'd invested 22 years of trying to change my orientation, and now I was in love with a man, and that to me as well, obviously this is never going to work, and I can't do this anymore. I was exhausted from ministry, from constant struggle, and a lot of your viewers today would relate to that. It never leaves you; it's there with you constantly.
Yeah.
And it impacts you mental health wise. And so what happened then was, I knew I couldn't preach anymore. It's interesting that up to that point, I felt like I could keep preaching because I was fighting it. But then when I found out it was about love, then I couldn't do it anymore. I couldn't stand up and preach and knowing that, I was in love with a man on the side. I couldn't do that. And so I resigned for the ministry. And if you've read A Life of Unlearning, that first chapter is that public confession in front of 800 people, which was devastating. And then when I walked away from everything, I walked away from my faith, my church, the family, friends, everything. It was not an empowering coming out. It wasn't like, yeah, you're accepted. It's like, oh my God, what choice of okay. It was a reluctant acceptance, and this is often the experience of people that they reluctantly accept. So they still haven't got to a point of celebration and pride.
Yeah.
So I was for the. Shall I go on?
Yeah, and then I've got some questions that are coming in for you. But by all means, I will,
okay.
finish up, the end of your story there.
Story, yeah. So what I've discovered is that for most of us, there's a period. I call it the ex-gay closet. It's a period of time, 6, 10 years, whatever, 15 years, where you don't want to talk to anyone about this stuff. You just want to forget about it and bury it. But it's just as damaging as an unresolved, orientation issue or anything like that. So it took me about 7 years, and then I had a profound spiritual experience, which reconnected me with God and reconnected me with my spirituality and resolved everything. And then 2000, I founded a ex-gay survivors group online, a Yahoo group. Some of you will remember Yahoo groups.
The folks who remember Reader's Digest can remember Yahoo groups.
But that had about 400 people in, so that was a big thing. Then 2004, the first edition of A Life of Unlearning came out, became a bestseller, sold out here in Australia, and my inbox became inundated, with emails that will make me weep when you're very familiar with that, the stories that you hear of how people have suffered and the things people have done to them. And so I started an organisation called Freedom to Be, which was a support network similar to what you found with GCN. And then after 6 years of that, I thought, you know what? I could be doing this for the rest of my life, but this is not the problem. The problem is up top, and we can run ambulances down the bottom of the cliff forever, but if we don't change things up top, we've got to build fences at the top of the cliff, so we don't have to run ambulances down the bottom. So that's when I founded Ambassadors and Bridge Builders International. So that's it. Here we are. How's that?
Yeah, I'm with you on that, and we can talk about that in a minute. Sort of the difference between addressing the source, the cause, versus just dealing with the symptoms. And sometimes there's a need for some of both. But I'm getting ahead of myself because I want to bring in some of the viewer comments here. First of all, we asked folks about Reader's Digest. Catherine says, love Reader's Digest. Derek says, if I can bring Derek's up. There we go. I loved reading Reader's Digest growing up. Amy says, my grandparents always had Reader's Digest, like mine. So, yeah. But Derek has a question. Derek says, a question for Anthony. Were you aware of the gay rights movement and events like Stonewall happening at the same time you were put through conversion therapy? I have a sense of some of the answer there because I've read your book, but I'll let you answer that.
Who was this person? What was his name?
Derek.
Derek. No, I wasn't. Australia at that point, communication coming from overseas was usually quite slow. Like we didn't often get films till 12 months after they'd been released. So, and because it was a criminal offence, it was not being talked about in the public space. Gay rights was not really beginning there. It was a little bit later in Australia that happened. So I was not conscious of that. And also, I was so full of shame that there was no pride there or no feeling like, I thought I was the problem, not society.
Yeah. Well, so one of the things that struck me when I read your book, and people are asking again for the name of your book, and you have a copy there. I have a digital copy, but I don't have a physical copy. If you wanna show it, if you've got it, it's
okay.
It's A Life of Unlearning. There it is.
This is how the author does it.
Yeah, you got it.
A preacher's struggle with his homosexuality, Church of Faith. I should mention, Jason, that this is the third edition now. The first two sold out, but you read the ebook, so that will never sell out, and this is now print on demand, so that will never sell out. So, I'm moving on to the next book.
Yeah. So one of the things that struck me about it is I mentioned right at the beginning that your experience and my experience were very different. My experience was growing up in the church. I wrote about in Torn that when for a long time I didn't think that I was gay because all I knew about gay people was they were having all kinds of sex, and I wasn't having any sex because I was a good Southern Baptist who wasn't having sex with anybody until marriage. I realized I was gay at a time that I didn't have any experience with the gay community, and when I heard in these ex-gay groups all of this discussion of this so-called gay lifestyle and all of these anonymous sexual encounters and things, I was like, well, I that's not my experience at all. That's not my life. Yeah. But it was to some extent yours. That you realized that you were attracted to men and had some, and you write about this in your book. I'm not telling anything that's but you had a number of sexual encounters, and you talk about them in your book prior to your involvement with the church, and then this was something that was a continuing struggle for you. So when in this sort of early ex-gay kind of language was all about the gay lifestyle and coming out of this lifestyle, did that resonate with you at all? Did you find yourself going, oh yeah, I know what that lifestyle is, or not?
Not before coming out, no, because those sexual encounters that I had, I mean, they began in my teenage years and continue right through my married life. Interestingly enough, Justin, when I came out and accepted my sexual orientation, those experiences died immediately, because they were fed, like what I really had developed was a sexual addiction. Now, some psychologists will say there's no such thing, but I'll tell you what, to me, it was like an addiction. It was, I'd be craving for this fix, I'd have the fix, and then I'd have to go through repentance and promise it will never happen again, all this stuff. But when you have an environment of shame, secrecy, condemnation, judgment, all those things around your sexual orientation, my experience is, and with the people I've worked with, is that it creates some really unhealthy behaviors.
Yeah.
There's a fragmentation of self. So the secret gay self will do things that the public self would never ever do.
Right. Isn't that fascinating though? That it is the attempt to suppress that ultimately leads to the behavior that then gets used as evidence that the thing you're trying to suppress should be suppressed. And there's this weird, I get it, like I understand where it comes from, but there's this weird thing that happens in a lot of those the churches that teach the kinds of things that your and my churches taught growing up, that to have a hookup and then repent of it is better than to be in a loving, committed relationship, because that's living in sin. And so you end up with folks who go through a series of one night stands or less than one night, just, hookups that don't even last the night, right?
60 seconds.
What's that?
60 seconds.
60 seconds. So the 60-second stands then, then, you keep going through this cycle of give in, repent, give in, repent, give in, repent, because to accept it would be to live in sin. And somehow this series, which is incredibly unhealthy, is viewed as less bad by some folks, because you're not, at least you're not accepting it. And you take a step back from that and it's like, oh my gosh, this makes no sense at all. This is like, wow. But
they
your
don't
book,
get that, do they?
Yeah, but your book illustrates that, how this became this repetitive addiction. So we've got a question from Levi, who, this is a long one, so hopefully it'll fit on the screen. Here we go. Let's see. Let's try it. Here we go. All right. Levi, you get a big picture because you had a big question. I went through the same thing, but as a worship leader. I lost almost all of my Christian friends. Now I can't find a church that will allow me and my partner to be fully functional members here in Las Vegas. Did you go through the same things, and how did you deal with it? It seems like it added more shame on top of the shame I already had. And then Levi adds, by the way, one day I prayed and asked God if it was okay for me to have a boyfriend. That next day, someone dropped torn right in front of my apartment doors. They were moving out of my building. Wow, that's how I found you, Justin. That's awesome. Thanks. I like that story.
Yeah.
So yeah, what was your experience like in that regard?
Look, Levi, for me, it was my experience of resolution was very, very personal. So nobody else was really involved with it except, I guess, God. And then that was enough for me. I have found my tribe, as I call it. And then my tribe, I have the greatest circle of friends. I don't feel the need to belong to a church community. That's not something I did for a while. I searched for that, and there was one here in Darlinghurst. It was a Baptist church, which was ended up getting kicked out because they had all the queers there. Um, but that was nice. But I've developed this sense. Everything you get in the church, I guess, except the worship, I created myself. So, I'd encourage you to volunteer, in gay rights organizations or any LGBTI organizations, and get connected with the tribe, because there's so many beautiful people out there.
Oh.
I'm not sure. Does that answer his question, do you think?
It sounds like a good answer to me. So Levi can let us know if he has more. So we've got some other questions coming in, but I want to talk a little bit more about this, the progression of the ex-gay movement over time. Is it still a thing that you see going on in Australia right now?
There's been some huge changes, and initially there were about 40 different organisations in Australia which were offering help for homosexuals. That's down to just a handful now, and most of those are presenting a celibacy model as opposed to a change model. But the thing that we all need to be very aware of, Justin, is that the ex-gay whole phenomena is based on a belief, a Christian belief that this is unnatural, this is not according to God's order. God created Adam and Eve, not Adam and Steve, all those things. And I remember when I went to speak at a conference in 2009 in Miami, actually, put on by Soul Force. And it was there that I said, look, Alan Chambers is talking about all these thousands of people that contact them on an annual basis, and we're really missing the point, because Exodus is not the problem. Those people are going to Exodus because they have a belief that where did they get the belief from? They got that in the church. And so, it's about focusing, I think, on changing people's beliefs or understanding of sexual orientation and gender identity. And that's where the problem is. And, but at that time in 2009, I think people just after blood, Exodus blood, they wanted to see the whole thing destroyed. Rightly so. But, the problem is that outdated belief system, which says, this is unnatural, this is not according to God's order, and if you pray hard enough, then God can change you. And that's going on in any Pentecostal, charismatic, evangelical church right across the world right now. And that's the ex-gay movement.
You and I are both what we would term side A, meaning that we're in full support of same-sex relationships and don't think that God has any problem with folks being in same-sex relationships. But, even like when I first started in this work, I know that there were very few side B voices, those who don't approve of same-sex relationship from a theological standpoint. Or I should say the sexual consummation of same-sex relationships, to be a little more specific there. But there were very few side B folks out there publicly who didn't believe that orientation change was an option and the goal. I mean, really, if you were not fully side A yet, your only option was like Exodus or an Exodus-like group. And, I think it's the growth of both a non-ex-gay side B community and a fully affirming side A community within the church that's given a lot of folks the ability to say, oh, this isn't my only option. And I think when people realize that there are other options, they can more honestly examine what's going on in the ex-gay movement and realize that it doesn't work and it never worked. At least I don't think it ever. I don't know anybody who I think has ever actually changed their orientation. Have you, in your experience over the years watching people get involved in one form or another with these ex-gay groups. Have you seen anybody who you think honestly has changed their orientation? I know you wrote in the book about like we need to be careful not to erase bisexuals, or I'm not sure if you said that or if somebody else I read said that today. But anyway, I know it's a thing that I read today, so I might be putting words in your mouth if you didn't say it. But it's true, yeah.
That's true, yeah.
So I don't want to, the bisexual experience is a little different. But in terms of like actually changing orientation, have you seen it happen?
No, not at all. A number of years ago, I coined a phrase, which was situational heterosexual. So, when people say, well, you're married, were you bisexual? I said, no, I was gay. I was gay. But in the situation, I could perform heterosexually. Take me out of that. It's like, in the same-sex environment, someone's in prison or in some of those situations where they will have sex with someone of the same gender. When they come out, they haven't turned gay. It's just a situation. And situational heterosexuality, the majority of those people who claim to be ex-gay, if, say, for example, a gay guy who's married to, a straight woman, there's no way he's ever going to be tempted to have sex with another woman. But to have sex with another guy, that could be there constantly.
Right. Just
go to the supermarket, going to walk down the street, yeah. And in the gym, anywhere. It's there with them constantly. So, no one has changed their orientation at all.
Yeah. I don't think so either. So we're in agreement about that.
And Alan Chambers is in agreement with us, thanks to you inviting him to speak at the conference where he said 99.9% that's gone down in history, thanks to you.
Well, that's at some point I'll have to have Alan come on the show and we'll talk about that, because I know Alan, has had quite a journey of his own. And for anybody who's listening or watching who doesn't know who Alan Chambers is, he was for many years the head of Exodus International, this massive ex-gay organization, and so that's a whole story in and of itself. But so let me bring in this question from John, who says, I believe that the LGBTQ community is scapegoated by the church to hide sexual scandal within the church. What are your thoughts on this in the light of Me Too and other revelations within the institutional church?
That's an interesting observation. I'm not so sure that we are the scapegoat for that. I think that, here's what I think is happening, is that the church is being challenged about their privileged place in society. And the rigidity of their belief system. I mean, look, the Anglican Church is a great example. I mean, people think that it's about the gay issue, but it's about politics. It's about Northern Hemisphere, Southern Hemisphere. It's about where the balances of power are. Like, in the Southern Hemisphere, that's where all the growth is in the Anglican Church. But also the conservatism and the sticking completely to a very fundamental black and white view of the scriptures. And what we're doing is we're asking them to have this, wonderful brick wall. It's got all my beliefs are in place. It's all cemented. It's tight. It's my foundation. And we're saying, well, why don't you just will you have a look at that homosexual brick? And you look at it and go, oh, actually, now look at the historical and cultural context and the original language. No, okay. So, what am I going to do now? I can't put that back in the wall. And if that brick was wrong, what about all the other bricks? So we are a huge challenge to them, because we are challenging the very foundation of their belief, and that's why it's so controversial. But the church has to learn to be more lenient, to be more open, to not be afraid of questions or even a doubt.
It is. I know for a lot of people I've met in this work, there is a real fear of like, if I start pulling one thread, what's going to come unraveled.
Yeah,
And I get that. I mean,
yeah,
I think so. You know, just last week on this show, I had a pastor named Kevin Nooner who I think is doing, you know, providing a great example for how you can question things and why you should question things as a Christian, and why that makes your faith stronger, rather, or at least can make your faith stronger rather than, you know, make it all fall apart. But I also know lots of folks who, you know, it's sort of like they started pulling a thread and then it's like, I just can't do this anymore.
yeah, yeah.
There's, you know, and so it's complicated. These are complicated questions. Um,
Because your eternal salvation is based upon that, you know. So, this is very frightening, and
yeah,
people who are from non-faith backgrounds, they don't get it.
yeah, yeah. Well, you know, it's I started to laugh when you said that your eternal salvation is based on this, because I'm like, I don't think that our eternal salvation is based on getting all the individual doctrines right, and yet I totally get what you mean. That like, yeah, there's this fear of like, you know, I'd rather just stay, don't ask questions, and just stay in this space, in this bubble, because I don't, at least I feel secure in my salvation here. And if I move anywhere outside of this space, I'm afraid of what's going to happen.
Right, right.
Um, I
For
just had a
many of
question. Oh, go ahead.
for many of us, Justin, the acceptance or rejection of our sexual orientation or gender identity has eternal consequences, and that's
Yeah,
frightening.
yeah, yeah. So let me ask you this. Um, you mention in your writings about you know, some of the differences between how some of this played out over the years in the U.S. versus how it did in Australia. Um,
Mhm.
what's what's your sense of the degree to which, or if at all, um, like American politics and American evangelicalism and so forth has had any influence in Australia on all of this? Do you feel like they're just separate, or is there influence there? What's your sense of that?
Well, what happened when I was preaching in the 80s was that um, uh, we very much in Australia look towards America as an example. I can remember I used to run church study tours and take pastors to the US to give them a whole, to expand their thinking, you know. I mean, we didn't have Christian television. We go, oh my God, you've got people singing about Jesus on TV. That's incredible, you know. And there were mega churches and there were all these things. So, you know, there was a lot of the influence, and still today, because American evangelicalism has been linked with politics. That also has influenced us here, and I know that people I see them quoting from websites in the US and stuff. So, yeah, you people have been really bad.
I mean,
Thanks for nothing.
I just remember, you know, I remember growing up, obviously here in the U.S. Um, uh, when I was, before I realized I was gay, there were certain evangelical, American evangelical leaders like James Dobson, who were very influential in my understanding of what it meant to be a Christian. And they also were very anti-gay. Um,
Right.
and so I conflated the two for a very long time. I just thought, well, you know, if this guy is what it means to be a Christian, and this guy is anti-gay, and he says that he's anti-gay because he's a Christian, and like, this is what it means. And I didn't question that at all until I realized I was gay. And then I started to realize how much of my understanding of what it meant to be a Christian I had taken directly from actually a very few people who had shaped in a tremendous way my understanding of what it meant to be a Christian. And that's kind of terrifying, because the only, like, I think, you know, Christ should shape my understanding of what it means to be a Christian, but
Yeah.
there's no other person who ought to be like the sole arbiter for
Yeah.
what it's all about. And I
Yeah.
feel like that's had an impact on a whole generation, because there are, so many of us at some point we realized, okay, some of the pieces we were taught weren't right. And then it just brings everything into question. And it's back to that pulling the thread thing.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
Um, so when I first started doing this series, I wanted to not just be serious all the time. And the last few ones that I've done have been mostly serious. And this has actually been, there's been a lot going on. Some of you who are watching know that a very dear friend of mine is in the hospital right now, and I'm very concerned with her health, and there's nothing I can do, and it's so I've been wrestling with, as we were getting ready to do this like conversation, like thinking I really don't want to just be like super super serious.
Right.
I also have a very heavy heart right now. I know some of the folks who are watching do, but I'm wondering if you could, like, what's tell me
Tell a
something
joke.
good. Tell me something good. That's some. What do you enjoy? What do you do when you just need a chance to unwind and get away from it all for a bit? Do you have any favorite hobbies or things that you like to read or watch television, or I mean, what do you do?
I don't watch television except when I'm going to sleep. Um, that's interesting you say that, because you know what happened. I'm naturally a humorous person. I'm naturally a fun person. I'm not good at telling jokes, but when I was a preacher, people would be cracking up all the time. When I got into working in this space, because the stories were so horrendous and the suffering so great,
Yeah.
you couldn't be anything else but serious and intense. And I found over the years that I just became more and more intense.
Hmm.
And I lost my fun side. And I lost my sense of humor. And I lost a very, very important part of me. And sometimes, we just had a drama here with a rugby player called Israel Folau, who goes to a Tongan church, which most of those are Pentecostal charismatic. And he put up on Instagram, 1 Corinthians 6, verse 9, all these drunkards and liars and homosexuals are going to go to hell. Repent. Well, the whole thing's just taken off. And I think, some people, like, I get quoted that verse at least once a week.
Right.
I'm sure it's water for ducks back. Hello. This is not going to harm you. And just, I think people need to chill a bit more in our space. And some people in our community, they're so intense, they're so aggressive, they're so wound up. Don't worry about me, having to watch TV. Worry about yourself. Can you just turn that down a little bit? Because they get the aggression and the hostility and the nastiness that's come out. It's this whole thing of this is the way we always interact. I have a model that I created about a way forward for churches to have a conversation about LGBTI issues, and I start off with that model. This is the way it's been, and I start off with, well, this is the way the gay community views the church, and this is the way that the church views the gay community, and eventually with that little model, people go, oh my God, they're both doing the same thing. Yes. And where does this get us? It doesn't get us anywhere. It just polarizes. And I loved your statement, was it you're fighting polarization?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And that's all that does. It's just keep separating. And we invite people into a safe space.
Mm-hmm.
And I had a wonderful privilege just a couple of years ago, being invited to work with the Global YMCA on the issue of LGBTI, to make the organisation affirming. And for those who don't know, YMCA is a very Christian organisation,
Right.
and wide. But within it, you have everything from social workers to people who believe unless you receive Jesus, you won't be saved.
Mm-hmm.
So everything theologically. I had 12 people in a room in the Czech Republic for 3 days. 5 of them were were from African countries where it was a criminal offence. 1 was a death penalty. I had to work with these people on this issue for 3 days, but we created a safe space for conversation. The YMCA globally, through that work, is now gay affirming, LGBTI affirming.
Wow.
But I remember when I used humour a lot in that thing. I talked about the work. I said, people think I'm lovely. I'm really lovely. I'm not an aggressive militant gay activist. I'm just a lovely person. Well, that went on for the whole 3 days. Oh, Anthony, you're so lovely. We need to lighten up a little bit, I think, and learn to laugh. Yeah.
So let me ask you then along those lines. You're doing work with Ambassadors and Bridge Builders International, your organization, to have these difficult conversations with Christians and Christian organizations that are not affirming.
Yeah.
To get to the source of those problems, like we were talking about earlier. That's a lot of work that I'm really passionate about, a lot of work that I've focused on over the years as well. I just think we can't possibly have enough people doing that. I think that's so important. And so I want to ask you a question that I get asked a lot. What do you say to the folks who say, those I've been hurt so much, we've been hurt so much by those people. Society is moving on. Just cut ties with them. Just move on and stop trying to convince those people to get on board. Just move on and just let them, eventually they're just going to die off, and let's just, focus on the folks who are already, LGBT plus, who need our support, and not worry about those folks who aren't there yet. What do you say to that?
Well, now on our website, I've got that model that I was talking about before, but also there is a continuum that I work with, which is the steps that people go through for understanding equality. And it begins off with being anti-gay. It goes hatred, dislike, discomfort, tolerance, acceptance, affirmation, advocacy. And so, you can't just wipe off people, go, well, let them die, because there are people in a questioning space, the movable middle, as it's sometimes called. People are questioning. I mean, that's why so many evangelical leaders have come out and go, actually, we got this wrong. Marriage equality? No. These people deserve to have marriage equality, And so they were prepared to question. They were looking. And the same here in Australia, we've got people that have done that same thing. They've paid a huge price for it, because they are the early adopters. So yeah, for people, I get where they're at and if you don't want to be involved in that space, that's okay. We're not asking everybody to be an ambassador for the community or to be a change maker. You just live your life authentically and honestly and with integrity. Well, I'm sorry, but you're doing advocacy when you do that, even if you don't realize it.
So then, given how much you've personally been hurt through this journey, I mean, there's a lot of pain that shows up in reading your story. A lot of guilt, a lot of pain, a lot of sense of shame that shows up. Why do you still do this bridge building work, and how do you still do it without just getting overwhelmed?
That's a good question. Sometimes I wonder myself, how come I've survived in this volatile space for now 19 years? It'll be 19 years now. And you know what? And you know yourself, it isn't just the opposition just doesn't come from outside the community. Sometimes the opposition comes from inside, and that's the most painful of all. You know, I could deal with whatever those Christian freaks want to say about me. It's what off a duck's back. But when the tribe starts doing things, that's very, very challenging for us. I've come to be aware. I don't know why it took me so long, but about 4 years ago, I became aware of my PTSD issues. And anyone who's been through ex-gay stuff and does not have some level of PTSD, I would say that would be a miracle. But so in being aware of it, I look back and go, oh my God, that's why I did that, that's why I did that. Some people think that I was a bit weird at one point. Well, that's okay. That was what was going on. So I'm learning to manage that better now. I think, because like at the moment, I'm researching for this book, The Quest to Cure Queers. What am I reading? Every anti-gay book I could get my hands on. You know, I've like you've got all your books. Looks very impressive behind you. All mine are over here, and it's all full of anti-gay books that I've been reading. You know, mental health book. You know, and people say, how can you do that? And either I've been given a grace to do this, which I think that's probably an element in there. Yeah. The other thing is that somehow or other I can separate myself and be an observer outside looking in. But having said that, there are times when I go, I was going to swear then. Can I swear or not? No.
You know, I haven't put any restrictions on what people say on these. We have a wide audience, so okay. I'll put it that way.
Well, I was going to say, you know, some of them go, fuck it. I'm over it, you know. I need a break. And you asked me before, what do you do? You know, well, it's usually time with friends or, you know, taking myself out for a nice meal and a glass of wine and, you know, doing something, you know, knowing when you've reached your limit. So there's a lot of things going on in there for me that I'm still around. I see people come and go, but, you know, I'm still around 19 years later.
Yeah. So we've got some.
And you, how long have you been doing this now?
It's been a long time. I mean, I came out. I mean, it's been more than 20 years since I came out, and as gay and Christian, and started speaking out publicly. And I've been doing it in one form or another for more than 20 years. And it's, yeah, you know, I didn't expect you to ask me that, but there are days when there are days when I'm sick of it. There are days when I'm sick of talking about it.
But you wouldn't swear like me.
Well, not in public, at least. You know, it's been interesting because, like, when I set up this series of conversations, you know, that now is also, you can get as a podcast, and, you know, it's on my YouTube channel. And I intentionally set this up with a kind of open range of topics to be explored, so that everything doesn't have to be about faith and sexuality and gender, even though that's what I've spent most of my life doing, you know. But so far, I think every guest that I've had on has had something to say, you know, on those topics. And some of them we've spent more time on that, and others we've spent less. But like, I feel like there's still so much that we need to talk about and so much work that needs to be done. And I want to help bring attention to folks who are doing this work, into the conversations people are having, whether I agree with them or not, just to like keep this going in a nuanced way. And yet at the same time, there are times that I'm just like, I'm so tired of it. And, I took on the GeekyJustin label rather than just being like gay Christian Justin, because it's like, I don't want to just be one thing, So I come to you here with my books behind me, and some of them are, and I do have most of the ex-gay books I have off camera because I don't really want to promote them.
You don't want to trigger people.
But yeah, for those who are watching the video of this, like I do have, a bunch of my books behind me, but then I also have like some of those books have nothing to do with sexuality and faith, and some of the stuff behind me has nothing, they're not books and they have nothing to do with it, just because I'm trying to find a balance in my life and find ways to relax and get away from just the stress of it, because the stress will just absolutely wear you out in terms of hearing other people's trauma and the and watching people make terrible choices that you can't save them from, and hearing people say awful things. Somebody said, one of the commenters, oh boy, there have been so many great comments, and folks, I've been reading your comments and I apologize, I haven't had the chance to respond to all of them.
Can I go back and have a look later on?
What's that?
Can I go back and have a look later on? Will they be on your wall?
On my
Facebook
page, yeah. Anyway, I apologize. I saw this comment earlier. Now I can't find it. But somebody else was talking about how tough it is. How just you can be going along and see something on YouTube, and it just takes you right back to that bad place. And it's like, yeah. You and I and a lot of other folks, even who are not trying to be these ambassadors and bridge builders, just living their lives, as you said, get subject to constantly people quoting those same passages and saying those same things, and it absolutely can just drain the life out of you if you're not careful.
Yes, completely. There's been a very popular post on our site. Maybe I should mention on our website, yes. www.abbi, which is abbi.org.au. And one of the most popular posts on there is 15 things I've learned talking about homosexuality and Christianity. Mm-hmm. And, there are some very practical things there, but learning how not to get triggered, learning when it's right to walk away. Your mental health is far more important than the cause. Hmm. And you need to take control of that. And there are the triggers, but it's knowing how. Okay, I just got triggered. What do I? And if you're not conscious of that, it's an automatic response, and you're down. Mm-hmm. You're down and out for the count. Mm-hmm. They got you with a Bible verse, but developing a consciousness of what's going on and becoming an observer, and then developing a strategy or management to get you out or through that thing is what helps. But it is a very weird space. The first few times I started doing this work, and I'd walk away and go, what's this weird feeling I have? It's a weird feeling. It's not a comfortable feeling. It's not a healthy feeling. But it's something, and that's when I guess I became conscious of the impact that this thing could have on you if you're not careful.
I think, so, as you're saying that, some commenters are talking about how to respond to those folks. And I think that the challenge is that there is I believe that the work that you're doing, and I think the work that I'm doing, I think the work that a lot of us who are trying in ways big and small to be bridge builders are doing, makes a difference. I've seen people's minds change. I've seen people's hearts change. Even when they continue to disagree on some points of theology, like that heart change makes a huge difference as well. Like I've seen that happen. I see it happen all the time. I know it does happen. And yet I also know that we can't go into these spaces with the expectation that people will change in a particular way on a particular timetable, because that is a recipe for frustration. That is how you get yourself just feeling absolutely exhausted, because you go in with your best arguments and whatever, and people aren't ready to hear them, and nothing changes, and you feel like you're butting your head against a wall. And so I think that patience and grace and self-care and all of that is so important. But I'm so grateful that you are continuing to do this work, continuing to build those bridges, and so we're about out of time. But for folks who want to find you, you've given the web address abbi.org.au for Ambassadors and Bridge Builders International. You have the one book out, A Life of Unlearning.
Great.
And then this new project you're working on, that's a book as well?
It's called The Quest to Cure Queers.
Do you know when that's going to be out?
Yes, when I finish it.
That's a good answer.
I've had so many deadlines. That people say, I love deadlines, especially the sound they make as they whoosh past you.
Yeah.
But hopefully before the end of the year,
Yeah, well, great. And so people can get in touch with you. Anything else you want to share before we...
I'm on Twitter, Gay Ambassador on Twitter.
Oh, Gay Ambassador. Okay, on Twitter. Awesome.
And I'm on, what's that thing where they show all the photos? Oh, Instagram. Instagram Gay Ambassador there. Look, what I would like to say, Justin, is thank you for all the years and all the work and all the energy. You've been a shining light to so many people. I know we've only had that occasional contact in Arizona and in New York, but I've always admired the pioneering work that you've done. It's been incredible. Thank you.
Oh, that's kind of you. Thanks. I appreciate that. I'm sorry that we haven't had more opportunities to chat. As you said, we sort of have ended up occasionally at the same conferences like you do in this work. It sort of passed by, but
I'll never forget that day in New York where we were together having a secret meeting with the evangelicals. Remember that? And they flew me all the way from Australia for a one day meeting. Do you remember that? That was incredibly special for me. I'm not sure that a huge lot came out of it, but I was very grateful for that. Do you know what I'm talking about? Arcus Foundation.
That one. Oh, yes. Okay. Yes. Now, no one else knows what we're talking about, so.
Yeah, it was a secret. Shh.
You just shared it with the whole world there. So.
You just have to shut down your Facebook page now.
Yep. Well, Anthony, thanks so much. Robert just posted, an hour is too short, Justin Lee. Well, I think if we went longer than an hour, nobody would watch or listen to these. But we can always talk again. I didn't get to ask you more about kind of what's going on in Australia, so we'll have to do this again, and you can tell me more. But thank you, and let me say thanks to everybody for tuning in, and to my Patreon patrons for making this possible, especially my Gold Star patrons, Terry and Larry and John and Bruce and Carol and Christopher and Tom and Liz. Thanks to everyone, and thanks especially to Anthony for taking his time to be here.
God, I love my tribe.
Well, have a wonderful week, everyone. Be excellent to each other, and don't forget the nuance. Good night. And good morning to you, Anthony.
Wherever you are in the world. Hello, goodbye.
Hello, goodbye.